Regardless of your political stance or your belief about the approach of another war, we can all agree on one thing. War is expensive. Trillions of dollars expensive. Today, we're going to take a look at the most expensive wars in United States history. The often forgotten Korean War. Nestled deep within the Cold War and sandwiched between World War II and the Vietnam War. The Korean War, unfortunately, is a bit like the middle child of American conflicts. It's there, but we don't really seem to give it the attention it deserves. Lasting from 1950 to 1953, the Korean War was the distinction of being one of the shortest wars in United States history. One might assume that means the war was cheap, but unless you consider $390 billion cheap, it certainly wasn't. It's estimated that the direct costs of the Korean War were somewhere around $390 billion. But that isn't factoring in indirect costs, which are estimated to be about $678 billion, adjusted to inflation. So, how exactly did the US scrape up all that money to ship off to their troops in Korea? One word: taxes. Income taxes, corporate income taxes, luxury taxes, capital taxation, all the taxes. Capital taxation reached its highest point in US history at 62%. This caused a lot of conflict within the American public because taxes were already creeping too high for the liking prior to Korea. Why was this? Well, you know, one of the other wars they had to worry about, the Cold War. This all being said, when you see photos of your relatives from this time period, don't blame them for not smiling. There was a lot going on. I mean, 4 wars in a 10-year span. That's something serious. While it may be easy for some to forget about the Korean War and all its spending, we're still spending money on this war to this very day. It's estimated that the US spends $2.8 billion a year on the veterans, widows, and children affected by the war. Considering the fact that there were around 36,574 deaths in the war and around 103,000 wounded, it isn't that hard to believe. Number 4. The Vietnam War. $950 billion. If you've seen a lot of movies, you've probably heard "I fought in Nam" for this quite a time or two. Statistically, this makes quite a bit of sense, considering the fact that 2.7 million Americans served in the Vietnam War. It might seem hard to get more expensive than $390 billion, but Vietnam was more than double the cost of Korea, estimated to be around $950 billion in direct costs. It was one pricey conflict. I mean, think of all you could do with $950 billion. The $950 billion used to fight the Vietnam War came from essentially the same place that the money for Korea did: taxes, and a decrease in funding towards non-military expenses. Even though the cost of the Vietnam War is extraordinary, the real cost of the war came at the expense of the soldiers. 1 in 10 soldiers that went to Vietnam didn't come home to their families, and 61% of the 58,220 soldiers who were killed were under the age of 21. I apologize for turning down the jokes for a moment there, but it's important to take a look for a moment at the true expenses paid for the wars that we've entered. Number 3. The Afghanistan War. $975 billion. The longest war in United States history, the Afghanistan War is also one of the most costly, ringing in at $975 billion so far. The 18-year conflict has cost Americans a pretty penny, and that's not including veteran care of the cost of interest. Financed primarily by increasing our foreign debt. We're looking at you, China. We've done a lot of work to cultivate that $975 billion. So how exactly was it used? $133 billion, about 16%, has gone to reconstruct war-torn Afghanistan. A vast majority of the funds have gone to support our troops and deploy military vehicles in Afghanistan. And considering the fact that from just 2010 to 2012, there were 100,000 troops deployed, there have been a lot of troops to support financially. An estimated 2,403 soldiers have died in Afghanistan, while an estimated 20,500 have been injured. Number 2. The Iraq war, $1.1 trillion. Between war and the War on Terror, the Iraq War managed to cost just a hair more than the Afghanistan War, at an estimated $1.1 trillion. Unfortunately, I have to put an emphasis on estimated there. No one really seems to agree on the direct cost of the war. I mean, it's almost like they're at war over the facts there, huh? Well, the general consensus as of 2019 lands it somewhere around 1.1 trillion. And that, my dear friends, is a lot of money. Trillions of dollars can be hard to grasp at times. For $1 trillion, you could buy every single person in San Francisco a $1 million apartment. You could pay the entire education budget of the United States and still have enough left over to buy your own private island in Hawaii. Now that we're on the same page about how much a trillion is, let's talk about what's even more money: the estimated indirect costs of the Afghanistan war, which include disability and interest, and is estimated to reach about $3 trillion. So, 3 years of the US's education budget and 3 private islands. Over the almost 9-year war, the US had a lot of time to spend that $1.1 trillion. During the peak of the war, the US spent about $12 million a year on refurbishing vehicles alone. For $12 million, I certainly could refurbish a few of my own. But I digress. Vehicles are costly during war, and so is their fuel. About 1.6 million gallons of oil were used by the US each day during the war. That's almost 3 Olympic-sized swimming pools worth of oil, though I wouldn't suggest going swimming in it. Again, in addition to the financial cost, 4,488 American soldiers were killed in the war. Number 1. World War II, $4.1 trillion. You might have an inkling about what war is the most expensive in US history. That's right. Get on your suspenders and break out your transatlantic accent, because now we're going to have a chat about the cost of World War II, the most expensive war the US has ever seen. But how expensive really was it? Adjusted to inflation, $4.1 trillion. At the peak of the war, defense spending in the US was 37.5% of the GDP, an unheard of number. So where exactly did those $4.1 trillion go, aside from killing Nazis and liberating Europe? Well, that $4.1 trillion helped create 41 billion rounds of ammunition, 434,000 tons of steel, 303,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks and tactical vehicles, 82,000 landing crafts, and helped support the 12.2 million Americans that were deployed. But how on earth did the US scrape up $4.1 trillion? Well, the old-fashioned way: war bonds. 63% of the war was funded by war bonds. If you didn't touch on this in history class in the US, don't worry, I've got you covered. War bonds were, well, bonds that were purchased at 50 to 75% their face value. Once they reached an age of maturity, often 10 years, they were sold for the face value. Buy a $100 bond for $50. You're in luck. In 10 years, you'll cash that puppy in for 100 big ones. Seen as an act of patriotism, bonds sold like hotcakes in the US, accruing about $2.5 trillion if adjusted for inflation. In addition to the bonds, the US raised taxes a considerable amount. The wealthy faced an income tax that fluctuated from 66% to a startling 94% in 1945. Whew, that's steep. Money aside, World War II was the most deadly in world history. An estimated 70 to 85 million people died. That would be like taking Los Angeles, copying it 20 times, and killing every single person. In 1940, that accounted for 3% of the population. In the United States alone, around 418,000 soldiers were lost in the conflict, which is roughly the size of Tampa or New Orleans. One of the craziest things about that $4.1 trillion is it's still increasing every year. There are still more than 100,000 veterans of World War II alive to this day, not counting spouses and children. Costs for veterans don't generally reach their height until about 30 to 40 years after a war is fought, which is something to really consider. So, there you have it, the 5 most expensive wars ever fought by the United States. What do you think about the costs of all these wars? And what do you think the United States can do to prevent another one? As always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. I'm Mr. Luxury. Pip pip to doodly doo.